Amen. So, welcome everybody. And hopefully you've got a Bible with you. Could you turn with me to Judges chapter 13? And we're going to have a good read around. And see where we find ourselves tonight. We're moving on to a brand new character here in the book of Judges. And one that most people have heard of, or they like, or is a favourite. So here it goes. Amen. And it says this. Again, the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Philistines delivered them into the hand of the Philistines for 40 years. Now there was a certain man from Zorah of the family of the Danites, who was named Manoah, and his wife was barren and had no children. And the angel of the Lord appeared to the woman and said to her, Indeed, now you are barren and have borne no children, but you shall conceive and bear a son. Now therefore, please be careful not to drink wine or similar drink, and not to eat anything unclean. For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son, and no razor shall come upon his head, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to deliver Israel out of the hand of the Philistines. Verse 6.
So the woman...
Yeah, you're coming through.
Okay. So the woman came and told her husband, saying, A man of God came to me, and his countenance was like the countenance of the angel of God. Very awesome. But I did not ask him where he was from, and he did not tell me his name. And he said to me, Behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. Now drink no wine or similar drink, nor eat anything unclean, for the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb to the day of his death. Then Manoah prayed to God, to the Lord, and said, O my Lord, please let the man of God whom you sent come to us again, and teach us what we shall do for the child who will be born. And God listened to the voice of Manoah, and the angel of God came to the woman again, and as she was sitting in the field, but Manoah, her husband, was not with her. Then the woman ran in haste and told her husband and said to him, Look, the man who came to me the other day has just now appeared to me. So Manoah arose and followed his wife. When he came to the man, he said to him, Are you the man who spoke to this woman? And he said, I am. Manoah said, Now let your words come to pass. What will the boy's rule of life and his work? So the angel of the Lord said to Manoah, Of all that I said to the woman, let her be careful. She may not eat anything that comes from the vine, nor may she drink wine or similar drink, nor eat anything unclean. All that I commanded her, let her observe. Verse 15.
Then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, Please stay here until I can prepare a young goat for you to eat. I will stay. But the angel of the Lord replied, But I will not eat anything. However, you may prepare a burnt offering as a sacrifice to the Lord. Manoah didn't realize that it was the angel of the Lord. Then Manoah asked the angel of the Lord, What is your name? For when all this comes true, we want to honor you. Why do you ask my name? The angel of the Lord replied. It is too wonderful for you to understand. Then Manoah took a young goat and a grain offering and offered it on a rock as a sacrifice to the Lord. And as Manoah and his wife watched, the Lord did an amazing thing. As flames from the altar shot up towards the sky, the angel of the Lord ascended in the fire. When Manoah and his wife saw this, they fell with their faces to the ground. The angel did not appear again to Manoah and his wife. Manoah finally realized that it was the angel of the Lord, and he said to his wife, We will certainly die, for we have seen God. But his wife said, If the Lord was going to kill us, he wouldn't have accepted our burnt offering and grain offering. He would have appeared to us and told us this wonderful thing and done these miracles. When her son was born, she named him Samson, and the Lord blessed him as he grew up. And the Spirit of the Lord began to stir in him while he lived in Manathadan, which is located between the towns of Zorah and Eshtaol.
Amen. So, here we go. On a brand new guy altogether. That kind of case. And it's a bit of a challenge. You guys keeping an eye on, just in case for the sound. Yeah, just checking. what have we got here? Well, we're into a brand new character altogether. So in the last couple of studies, our last 3 chapters put together, we've looked at the narrative of Jephthah and travelling these 70 years, not all of it Jephthah, the last bit of it really Jephthah, but this whole 70 years after Abimelech was king. So Abimelech being a king and that being a failed reign, after that is a 70-year period of rest. In the same way that after the period of kings, from Saul right the way through to Zechariah, there'll be a 70-year gap, and there was a 70-year gap, and then the promise of restoration. And in the same here, at the end of the 70 years after Abimelech was king, we get the promised restoration as it begins because Samuel is born. And the book of Judges, just to remind you in case you've forgotten, is a book that was written by Samuel. Not for the people who were alive at the time of the book of Judges, but for the people who were alive at the time of Samuel. And the people who were alive at the time of Samuel learned all of this and needed to learn where Israel had come from Joshua, who had taken the land and got them to a position where they just needed to drive out the enemy individually in each of their tribal areas and thus take the land and stretch on to the land that God had promised Abraham right the way up to the Euphrates. And instead what they proved is they settled in what they got. They dealt with what they got. They didn't push for any more. In fact, what they got had shrunk. They made peace with those around them. They began to go further and further and further away from the Lord. And the roller coaster of the book of Judges, of sinning against the Lord, a nation coming against them, a judge being raised, the judge moving the enemy out, everybody going back to God, and then back round again, started. Although it's not always exactly been like that. There's not always been an enemy, as we've seen. There's at least 5 judges that had nobody to drive away. In fact, they were judges in peace, because the purpose of the judge was not to be a military commander, but it was to actually judge. It was to judge what the Lord says about a thing, not what this party says or that party says. Which party's right? Well, the law according to the Lord. And that's what they were called to do. And Samuel is showing this journey that the children of Israel have been on to get to. Except for when we get to this particular character and where we are now, well, we have to start realizing that if this is Samuel's history of where the children of Israel have got to, and what he's really trying to show them is that they need to choose God to be their king, and they need to be obedient to his leading, rather than looking to a human ruler to lead them, what the children of Israel do is they choose a human ruler. And we really are into the last bit of this. But let's come back to that. In a sense, there are, in the book of Judges, shall we say, these little sections. So the Jephthah period was a section, taking us through these 70 years. 3 chapters calling this. Gideon was a little section that you could kind of connect together. Chapters 1 and 2, which was kind of like the beginning and the end of Joshua, was a kind of a section. And now we get into another 4-chapter section, which completely focuses on Samuel. And so Samson even. As a sense, I'm going to do that all night, I can see as well. I've been writing it out all day, I've been writing Samuel. No, Samson. No, Samuel. The wrong way around. It would have helped if one was with a J and the other was an S, really, but no, they're both Sams along the way that comes in. So we get these little mini-series. And in fairness, I think we'd probably all be honest to say that when we've ever looked at the Judges, and for often, most of us have only ever really looked at them when we're doing children's work, any form of children's work, you kind of look at these characters and their little mini-series, and you take that and you kind of divorce it from the rest of the book, or you don't necessarily connect it to the rest of the book, or that it's a message that's in context with not just this book, but with other books, including 1 Samuel. So we can take this little mini-series, and we're going to head on to another one now, going from chapter 13 through to chapter 16, which takes us through the life of Samson, this larger-than-life character, the guy that's got the greatest caricature that exists, really, on any of them, who's even got his own #1 hit out there in the chart. I'm from Stoke-on-Trent, and every time Stoke play in football, they always sing the song, why, Delilah? it's a good question, and the answer is because of the Weetabix advert. That I know, the Weetabix advert, because they sang the song in the Weetabix advert, and then they say, he's only gone and had his Weetabix. And it's this whole, and you're going, oh yeah, it all makes sense now. No, it makes no sense at all. It's the whole idea is, why did Stoke win? It's a mystery. The only answer could be they've had their Weetabix. How did they do 7 years in the Premier League? It is a mystery. So the whole kind of thing about Samson is, it's very hard to take him seriously because there are certain characters, shall we say, in the Bible that play quite easily into this is it not a nursery rhyme? This feels a bit nursery rhyme-ish. This feels a little bit like it's heroes and villains and Marvel comic and all of that kind of thing about it. Is it really this? Here's this guy who's got such strength that he tore a tiger in two and carried a set of gates somewhere and all of these things and took down 1,000 men with the jawbone of an oxen. Is it really true? So we kind of say he's a Sunday school character. He's one that we deal with for the children, and they love it because it's so up their street. He is this superhero in the Bible, and he is kind of like a superhero in all of the things. And because he is this caricature, it's hard for us then in shall we say, a Bible study to sit here and go, actually, we're talking about a real human being here. Because he doesn't sound like a real human being. It actually sounds like a legend. And when it comes to the study of Samson, not only do we suffer with the caricature image of him, which is this big beefcakey man with long hair and a big beard, even though, of course, that would make it completely obvious as to why he was strong, because he's strong. He's hampered, another one that's hampered by being consigned to children's work. Indeed, actually, I can think of at least 2 of our holiday clubs, we've done a Samson video. We did one this year. I know that we've done one, I think, maybe the second year I was here, the year we did the Pirates, because I remember playing Samson in that one. And I was throwing kids across the grass as I was trying to pretend that I was this super strong, superhuman. And of course, this year we had it, and Dan was playing who Samson was with the wig and everything on. And what we kind of do with him is in both of those, certainly in both of those teachings that we did here as a church, and probably what most are done when they do it in children's work, is they kind of take this character in the Bible that had this supernaturally given power, and we try and really emphasize the point that it wasn't a natural power, it was a supernatural power, to emphasize what it is when God can work within a person. And then, of course, what we can really learn about this guy is, here he is, this guy who had the power given to him from God, and he has this great fall in his life, where in the end, he has to come to realize that the power that God gave him wasn't for his own use, but should have been for the use of the Lord. And that's very much how people kind of read him. Yet he's the judge that's got the most written about him. There's a lot, actually, there's that. He's the only one that we get a his birth written about him kind of conversation that all comes along. So how can we really sum his life up into this small bit when there's so much that's said about him? And why is there so much that's said about him in comparison, say, to some of the other judges and the other characters? And particularly ones like last week, our very last one, that only had 1 sentence written about him that kind of came in that. So much so that we can't even remember his name, and I can't at all. And I only have to look there, and there he is. What's his name? Not Elon. Yeah, Elon. Elon. Didn't even know he was a judge. There we go. He's got 1 sentence. Whereas Samson's got 4 whole chapters that are written about him and this whole process. Now, if we can acknowledge the fact that we've both probably summed him up in the way I've just summed him up, and that we struggle with him as a real human being, and the other thing that people kind of struggle with him is the fallen nature that kind of is shown about him, then there's something that we're going to get out of this if we can just grab hold of that and put it to the side. So all you kids workers and those that wrote the videos and have done the videos, you'll be pleased to know I'm not going to say that you are absolutely wrong. I can't believe that we did that video at the kids club. We need to get all the children in again and reteach them that that was wrong, because there is very much a teaching about Samson that is taken about somebody who didn't use his gifting at one point in his life until it was too late, shall we say, and at the end of his life he learned that his gifting was given to him for the purpose of serving God, not serving himself. And there's a lot going through his life that really feels like he's just a self-serving guy. He's a self-serving guy who ended up in this situation, and it isn't until the only thing he can do is kill himself that as it comes along. And we'll talk later about whether this is a suicide attempt or not. I'm not going to get into that today. We'll have a look at this over the next few weeks and get into the whole kind of teaching, because that's very much a controversial element of the subject. As is, I'm not going to talk to you today about whether the strength was in his long hair or in his Nazirite vow, other than to say to you, he never made a Nazirite vow. The vow was made for him. How long was now we're getting your way to think. And now you start to see he's actually got a lot more about him. One of the things about him really is clearly a fallen man. It indicates that the Lord calls us, the Lord uses us, even though he's well aware of our flesh nature, because he was a judge. God called him, and he didn't do anything that God wasn't expecting him to do. So it was not a surprise in any way, shape, or form. And to understand that, and I have to say this, I can stipulate it as much, there just seems to be this crazy idea, and I suppose I get where it's coming from. If the people who are in leadership set themselves that they have a right to be in leadership because God has called them and they have a better character, when that character slips, then I suppose everybody has a right to say that, well, you said you had a better character. I find in my purpose it's better to just suggest I don't have a better character. And that way you won't all be that surprised when I slip. But on the other side of it, I don't get the burning of books and the destroying of ministry that once blessed you and encouraged you when you later found out that such and such had done this, or has done that, or has even left the faith. And it's a real shame for them if they've left the faith. It's a terrible thing if they've fallen. It's a more terrible thing if we ostracize them because they have. But it's an absolutely ridiculous thing for us to suggest that if somebody sins, then that means that everything they did up to that moment was godless and irrelevant. And really the great character in the Bible that teaches us that that's nonsense is David, who really didn't get up to his really greatest hits until he actually became king. He did all his sinning in the later parts of his life rather than in the younger parts of his life. But if we were to throw away all of his ministry because of Bathsheba, then we wouldn't have Psalm 23 or Psalm 22 or Psalm 24. We wouldn't have any of these earlier things. We wouldn't have half of the things that he's written. And in fact, we wouldn't even have the great psalm he writes about his sin with Bathsheba. So we wouldn't have all of the things that are written there, and it's a ridiculous notion to pass away. So understand, we don't surprise God when we fall short of the glory of God. He called you knowing who you were and knowing exactly what you were going to do. And so he called Samson knowing exactly who he was, and he really literally called him before he was knit together in his mother's womb. And that's what this chapter is about today, who was called before he was conceived. But the Lord who knows the end from the beginning. Now, if we take that statement to its conclusion, then surely the question that has to be asked is, was Samson's story therefore always going to end with him bringing the house down on the Philistine lords? If the Lord already knew it, does that mean he was called because the Lord called him to have his falls, to have his slips, to end up blinded and in the house of Dagon, ready to push down the pillars and land on everybody? Now, the scriptural answer when it comes to predestination is that the Lord knows all things. So, yes, it was. But then the other side of that scriptural answer is the Lord also gives us the chance to make our own choices. So, although the Lord knew it was going to happen, nothing is inevitable. There was always the option that this isn't what happened. And even though Samson's death wasn't inevitable, what his death achieved was exactly what Samson was called to do. Have a look at verse 5 of chapter 13 again. And somebody read that out for us.
For behold, you shall conceive and bear a son. No razor shall come upon his head, but the child shall be a Nazarite to God from the womb, and he shall begin to save Israel from the hand of the Philistines.
Now listen to that phrase. We've got the Nazarite bit. I mean, the Nazarites love it when I tell them about this. And at the end of the Nazarite vow, they're supposed to shave their hair off. And can you imagine Anna's look along that line all of a sudden? The debate as to whether Anna would suit the shaved over haircut that came along. But, or even if Dan would have achieved that, or should we say even Carol would have looked good with the shaved over hair. That's it. I don't know whether we should go for that look or not. That kind of came with it. But the actual thing that is important out of that is not the Nazarite vow side of it, it's the calling side of it. And something interesting is worded in that, the vital important phrase here. And this is one that's unique. No other judge gets a statement like this. Every other judge is called to get rid of the enemy. But this one is called to begin getting rid of the enemy. The begin is the phrase that is the key phrase here. He was to begin something, but he wouldn't be the one that finished it. He was here to begin something. And when we start to realize that, there is a serious question that's asked about Samson. Now, when we look at Jephthah, what we know is that Jephthah was called by the people, not by God, to fight this war against the Ammonites. But it was in his position that God called him. Whereas Samson was called to begin, in fact, very specifically, to deliver Israel out of the hands of the Philistines. That is what is here, and that's what his ministry is. He is here to drive out the last of these nations in the period of the Judges. And as such, the wayward behavior of chasing after women, gambling with others, being a brute, and seemingly heartless man of violence might actually be seen as a fulfillment of his own calling. God called him to pick a fight. And he did it very well. In fact, he did do it very well. Now, am I saying, therefore, God called a man to sin? Well, if I was, it would be time for me to leave the church. Of course I'm not saying such a thing, because that would be contrary to the word. God didn't call this man in his ministry to have a ministry that sinned in order to pick a fight. But I'm challenging you to question something. If all the bad things that we think about Samson actually were bad things, was it sin? Turn with me to Judges 14. Let's have a look at verses 1 to 4. Here's his first wife. Well, his wife.
Samson went down to Timnah and saw there a young Philistine woman. When he returned, he said to his father and mother, I have seen a Philistine woman, now get her for me as a wife. His father and mother replied, isn't there an acceptable woman among your relatives or among your people? Must you go to the uncircumcised Philistines to get a wife? But Samson said to his father, get her for me, she's the right one for me. His parents did not know that this was from the Lord, who was seeking an occasion to confront the Philistines, for at that time they were ruling over Israel.
Samson married the woman, to get his reason for a fight. Now, let me ask you a question. Is it a sin for him to have married a Philistine woman? According to the law? No. It's the 7 Canaanites that they're not to marry into. But not the Philistines. In fact, we've seen before, Boaz had a Moabitess wife. David and Solomon had Gentile wives. It isn't that way round. Remember, the husband is the one who brings the tribe. And here is in the sense and in the case of what it is. They are the sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The sons of the father is to where their hereditary comes through and comes from. And so, no, it wasn't wrong for him to have it. But now have a look at verses 1 to 3. Just so that we can defend this a little bit more. Sorry, Judges 15, verses 1 to 3.
After some days, at the time of wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife with a young goat, and he said, I will go into my wife in the chamber. But her father would not allow him to go in. And her father said, I really thought you utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead. And Samson said to them, this time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines when I do them harm.
He never even slept with her. So she was his wife, but it was never a consummated wedding. So even if there was an issue, the issue that he married her for, because the Lord told him to do it, and the reason the Lord told him to do it was because of what was about to happen. They gave him the legal reason in Philistine law, not in Judaic law, but under Philistine law, he had the right to vengeance. He was now legally acceptable under Philistine law to demand that he could start taking the fight to them. And they couldn't come against him. Now, you might think, does that really matter? Well, imagine some enemy comes against the United Kingdom. Some foreign power decides to invade Devon. Bless them, Devon. And as it comes that every man and woman, now, because it's the 21st century, every man and woman is called to take up arms, that Scotland rings and says, yeah, no, we're leaving the United Kingdom. It's not our fight. And Wales leaves and says, no, it's not our fight. And then Cornwall calls and says, we've been wanting independence for some time, and this just seems like the right kind of time. And then the North calls and says, no, we're calling ourselves Mercia again. We're not part of you. Because the Philistines were not a nation of people who all agreed together. They were a series of cities with the same hereditary. But hereditary didn't lock them together forever. Now, if you kick a hornet's nest, you're going to get the whole lot. But if you swat one hornet, that's your battle. Here, he had a legal reason, and maybe some of the Philistine lords would go, no, we're not getting involved in that, because this is an internal dispute between a husband and his wife and the family, and maybe the town's going to get involved. And that's how you do it. You pick one off, and then you pick the other one off, and then you pick the other one off, you pick the other one off. The big mistake that you make is when you try and take the whole lot on together. So very cleverly, here we start realizing about Samson is he's not a womanizer and a gambler. He's a calculated judge who's been called to pick a fight with a people, and he does it in a legal manner, which means that he's able to start doing what he was called to do and free Israel from the oppression of the Philistine army. And there we go, we've just all of a sudden rehabilitated Samson's. Of course, there is still chapter 16, and that was his lust moment, his mistake moment, his error moment, which then leads him to be in the position that he's in. But he never consummated the wedding. Instead, he was right legally to demand vengeance according to the Philistine law as it was met. The story of Samson is often of a man who's got a bad reputation. But actually, it's not a deserved reputation. And truly, his affair with Delilah was truly his great error. That was his mistake. But up until that point, the wayward one is actually just a sufferer of bad press. There was little that was wayward about it. It was deliberate in its means. Hence why the phrase that's repeated often in these scriptures, the Spirit of the Lord came upon him. The Spirit of the Lord does not come upon somebody to sin or to ask for revenge for their sin. The Spirit of the Lord only comes upon when our will intersects with the Lord's will. And we're doing exactly what God has called us to do. In fact, actually, there's quite a lot that's unique about this judge. His endued supernatural strength is one of these things. Think about all the other judges. We've had a left-handed one. We've had one that likes riding on donkeys. We've had the son of Caleb. But other than Deborah, who was a prophetess, of none of them have we heard the words, the Spirit of the Lord came upon them, or that they had any form of supernatural gifting, something that was given to them by God directly to do their gift that other people didn't have at the time. Deborah was a prophetess. But Samson had this strength. All of us had natural gifts or exercised great faith, and don't get me wrong, great faith is a gift, but they were skilled men of war, or they were skilled politicians, or they were people who had sons that rode on donkeys. But all put together, they were men of peace and men of judgment and men of war, but they were not men who were endued with this great spiritual power. He was also the only judge who was called to the roll from birth. All the others, it came upon them at a time. But there's also one other thing that makes him unique. He's the only judge who was called before the people actually called out to God to repent and to ask for deliverance. In actual fact, they hadn't asked God for anything. What we read in the very first verse is, of course, that the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. So the story of Samson is far more complex than many give credit to. And he isn't so much the godless man as made out. In fact, so much so, have a look at Judges 15, verse 20, which is the final word. It's repeated in Judges 16 as well, but Judges 15, 20, what does it say?
And he judged Israel 20 years in the days of the Philistines.
He was also one of the guys who judged people for one of the longest periods, certainly of the more recent in that time frame judges. He was a judge for 20 years. So he wasn't a godless man. He wasn't a womanizer. He wasn't a gambler. He wasn't a brute. He was called to start a fight with the Philistines when the people didn't want particularly to have a fight. And so, if he was a man called to pick a fight, to understand that, we've really got to understand Samson taken out of the usual isolation chamber that we study him in. Normally we just study Samson, the character. But if we take Samson, the character, and stick him in Israel at a time of Philistine occupation, what does Samson see around him? And what are the people around him looking at Samson? What's going on in the area that's around, and what might we see? Because we have to put him right into the middle of his time zone. And that requires us to do a little bit more reading around. But for Samuel's audience, the one who wrote this book, he doesn't have to. So the reason that the history, the background isn't given to us about Samson is because we're now not in history. The people who were reading this book knew Samson. Because now we're in their time period. And that's really important. Now, I didn't know this. I'd never put that together before. I never would have put Samuel and Samson together. But to realize that they both existed and lived at the same time, and were talking to the same people, then we start to get to understand that the reason Samuel didn't have to tell the people in the book about Samson is they knew him. But maybe they didn't know the story about Samson, and they didn't know the things behind Samson. They didn't know about the call of Samson, and they didn't know about the life of Samson. They just knew about this guy who went and pulled down a whole temple on a load of people. And since it was, Samuel didn't need to include the background information because they knew it. But the background information is the vital requirements to understanding what's happening in Samson's life. In fact, without knowing it, Samson becomes a caricature. He's just this strong guy. And it doesn't really make any sense as to why does this guy fighting against the Philistines. Because we've heard that name before. That's a David and Goliath thing. That's a Saul thing. They're kind of around. When are they? Are they here the whole time? What's the whole time period that comes on? But we have to understand it. We have to understand what's happening in Samson's life for us to understand both all of the chapters and particularly our chapter today. So before we get on to our chapter today, I need to give you that background. Otherwise, you won't get it. So before we look at the chapter as a whole, let's discover its context. Now, remember that we discovered that up to Judge Ibzan, which the Jewish teachers believe was actually Boaz, was the 70-year period that comes after the failure of a king. And then the beginning of the restoration, which was, in this case, the birth of Samuel. So Samuel was born. Then we're followed by 25 years of judges. These three non-kind of eventish judges that seem to live in peace. Even though the restoration period was there, they didn't go jumping into a restoration. In fact, it was a time when nobody did much of anything, and it's categorized by what we read here in verse 1 again, that the children of Israel once again sinned from the Lord. And yet, unlike periods before, they didn't go a long time without a judge. They had a judge year in, year out, every year, up until this moment, and they still went wayward. There was always somebody there that they could go and find out what God wanted in the situation, but they didn't do it anyway. They had prosperity, they had peace, and they still chased after other gods. And 2 times we've read them do that now. Spiritually speaking, we have this pre-history of Samson understood by what the Lord said to Samuel when he was just a little boy. Turn with me to 1 Samuel 3, verses 11 to 14. This is spiritually, even if the land was in peace, spiritually, this is what the Lord was saying. And he could seemingly only say it to a 7-year-old boy.
Then the Lord said to Samuel, "Behold, I will do something in Israel at which both ears of everyone who hears it will tingle. In that day I will perform against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from beginning to end. For I have told you that I will judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knows, because his sons made themselves vile, and he did not restrain them. And therefore I have sworn to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever."
Whose job is it to go before the Lord and make atonement for the nation? The high priest. And who is the high priest? Eli. Whose job is it to carry the human and thummim so that if people want to ask the Lord a question, he can draw the answer by lot? It's the high priest. It's Eli. It's in his breastplate. He carries the heart of Israel on his chest. His only job once a year is to go in and sprinkle some blood around on the mercy seat and make atonement for the nation. He is not God's voice to the people, but he is the people's voice to God. And in this respect, he is the representation of all Israel to go, but God has to speak to the 7-year-old boy. That tells you where the nation is. As they say, if the apples in the barrel are rotten, you have to go to the tree to take them off. And that's the important guy. Now, Samuel here is only 7. Samson is not yet born. Yeah. So we're still in the period of Ibzan. We're in the period of Boaz. There's 2 other judges to come. So we're in this 25-year period before we read what we read here in verse 1 of chapter 13. So if you imagine that 25 years plus 40 would make Samuel at the end of that 40 years 65. Not necessarily a particularly old person, but in the ancient world, old enough that he is considered, and they are looking at who might take on and take through him and come after him. And of course they make the declaration that they want a king and not his sons. Yes. Around the time frames, yeah. And it's important that we get those time frames. So you have these 25 years with the 3 judges that we finally finished of last week, Ibzan, Elon, and Zilwood, I think it was. And then we get into chapter 13, verse 1. And it's no wonder that it says that in 13, that it tells us that the people went off after other gods, because we know exactly why they did. They despised going to the temple. Why did they want the temple, the tabernacle? Why did they despise going to the tabernacle? Because of Hophni and Phinehas, and Eli wouldn't tell them off. Hophni and Phinehas, they stole the offering and the tithes for themselves. They stole God's part of the offerings. Instead of waiting for their amount that was allotted to them by law, they took the fat as well, and they roasted it, and they ate it, and they fiddled with all the women. So much so that nobody wanted to go there anymore. Nobody wanted to be a part of it anymore. No wonder they started looking to other people. They didn't want to be anywhere near the priests anymore. And you only have to look on a newspaper and see that kind of case. You see that in some of the established churches of people who will never, ever step foot in a church again, not because of God, but because of the minister of the such and such. And, back to the question that Anna asked last night, which was about why might there be a greater responsibility on teachers? Because in many respects there's that possibility that we have of driving people away for them never to come back again. There are many things that we can do that will not have a positive reason for somebody to come to the Lord, but if we don't do them, they will have a negative reason for them never to come to the Lord. And that can be a lot of things, even down to what you wear when you're preaching or teaching and so on and so forth. So we have to know that it's not all about your freedom. It's actually about the gospel going forward. But here we go. We've got this character. And in that time period, the godlessness of it so much is that God can only speak through a 7-year-old. And Eli says to Samuel, you better tell me everything, otherwise it's going to come on you as well. And when Samuel tells him absolutely everything, does Eli do a Nineveh? Does he throw on the sackcloth and ashes and say, oh Lord? Because the Lord doesn't say there isn't a chance of repentance. He says that this isn't going to go on indefinitely. There will come a point where you've pushed it too far. And I would have hoped, and that doesn't mean I would have, in fact I'm stupid enough that I may not have, but I would hope that we would have taken that as listening to God saying, deal with it. Deal with it where you've got a chance to deal with it, but he didn't. And so that lets you know where the spiritual state of the whole nation was, and hence why they chased after their other ones. So this period of oppression, which in this case is 40 years, well, unusually, it's not ended by the judge that started it. In fact, the period of the Philistine occupation, this 40 years that starts here in chapter 13, verse 1, well, turn with me to 1 Samuel 7, this is where it finishes. 1 Samuel 7, and we're going to read verses 1 to 14.
And the men of Kiriath Jearim came and took up the ark of the Lord and brought it to the house of Abinadab on the hill. And they consecrated his son Eliezer to have charge of the ark of the Lord. From the day that the ark was lodged at Kiriath Jearim, a long time passed, some 20 years, and all the house of Israel lamented after the Lord. And Samuel said to all the house of Israel, if you are returning to the Lord with all your heart, then put away the foreign gods and the Ashtoreth from among you, and direct your heart to the Lord, and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. So the people put away the Baals and the Ashtoreth, and they served the Lord only. Then Samuel said, gather all Israel at Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord for you. So they gathered at Mizpah and drew water and poured it out before the Lord and fasted on that day and said there, we have sinned against the Lord. And Samuel judged the people of Israel at Mizpah. Now when the Philistines heard that the people of Israel had gathered at Mizpah, the lords of the Philistines went up against Israel. And when the people of Israel heard of it, they were afraid of the Philistines. And the people of Israel said to Samuel, do not cease to cry out to the Lord our God for us, that he may save us from the hand of the Philistines. So Samuel took a sucking lamb and offered it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. And Samuel cried out to the Lord for Israel, and the Lord answered him. As Samuel was offering up the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to attack Israel. But the Lord thundered with a mighty sound that day against the Philistines, and threw them into confusion, and they were defeated before Israel. And the men of Israel went out from Mizpah, and pursued the Philistines, and struck them as far as below Beth-kar. Then Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shen, and called its name Ebenezer, for he said, till now the Lord has helped us. So the Philistines were subdued and did not again enter the territory of Israel, and the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines all the days of Samuel. The cities that the Philistines had taken from Israel were restored to Israel from Ekron to Gath, and Israel delivered their territory from the hand of the Philistines. There was peace also between Israel and the Amorites.
Amen. Now stay in 1 Samuel 7, because we're going to look at a few scriptures here. The battle that Samson started, Samuel finished. And the end of that 40 years is the end of 1 Samuel 7. And we already know what 1 Samuel 8 is. 1 Samuel 8 is calling for a king. So it lets you know that the 40-year period that we're just starting on now is actually the period of time that Samuel lived and served and worked through. And he worked beyond that, and it tells us that he judged beyond that. But at the end of that time, he was 65. But there's a couple of things that are to point out. What happens in this 40-year period from Judges 13:1 through to 1 Samuel 7? Well, Eli and his whole house are killed. And in that death of the high priest and his sons, and the outworking exactly of what the Lord had said to 7-year-old Samuel, the Ark of the Covenant is carried away. The Ark was captured. But then it was also returned. We understand it's returned 7 months later. We understand that by what was written there in 1 Samuel 7:1. It was returned 7 months later. Was it returned by human hands? No. It was the Lord who brought it back. And the Lord, and now this gives us a little bit of an understanding as well, because they took the ark and they put it in the temple of Dagon. What temple does Samson bring down? Temple of Dagon. So we understand that that hasn't happened yet. So there's a nice crossover here that we can see. So that Samson was alive before the ark is captured by the Philistines. They take it there, and every morning they wake up, the statue of Dagon has fallen from its feet and is laying prostrate before the Lord. Not an Israelite in sight. And God is having the victory, and then everybody gets an attack of the hemorrhoids. So what happens after that? And mice. So they put golden mice and golden hemorrhoids inside the Ark of the Covenant, and they stick it on a cart and they let it go, and it makes its way back to Israel. And they kind of check to see, is it God or it isn't? Because here's the green field and those milk cows are going to go for that. Or here is a road where it's a desert and no animal would go that way. So if it was natural, it was just a box, it will go that way. And if it was of God, it will go that way. And of course it was of God, it went that way. And the Israelites, glory be, looked out one day as the Ark of the Covenant made its own way back home. But when it makes its own way back home, they stick it in the house of Kiriath Jearim. And then what does it say in verse 2? How long does it stay there for? 20 years until what? Somebody read that bit out. Just read 1 Samuel 7:2 out.
It was quite a long time, some 20 years in all, that the ark stayed in that place. All the people of Israel longed for the Lord.
Now, understand, it stayed there for 20, it actually stayed there for a lot longer than 20 years. It stayed there until David tried to bring it back. But it stayed there for 20 years until people wanted God back. It stayed there for 20 years. In this 40-year period, we know that the ark was taken, and then it was 20 years. And on the minute, the moment that the people all of a sudden say, you know what, we need the Lord back in our lives. Our lives need to come back. The hearts of the sons needed to turn back to the fathers once again. And once that genuine restoration happened in the people, now the ark began to have a significance again to them. And the minute it did, and only when it did, that we see the Lord destroy the enemies. Just like the Lord had done with every other judge. That when the people cried out, he raised up a judge and the enemies were vanquished, except for the people didn't cry out. So God raised up a judge to make the people cry out. And then he raised up another judge to vanquish their enemies. So Samson had a very important job. One that was in line with Samuel. Now that gives you a whole kind of time frame and background of things. And just as with every other judge, after the abatement of those enemies to whom the Lord raised a judge to defeat, then the judge judges the people. Only it wasn't Samson now. Who was it? Have a look at 1 Samuel 7:15. What happens now that the Philistines, the end of that 40 years is over? Somebody read it out.
Samuel led Israel all the days of his life.
So Samuel went on. He was 65 at this stage. He went on to judge for the remainder of his life. And as he got to his old age, and his sons were not up to the task, the people cried out for a king. The cycle of judges comes to a close, not because they've learnt that a theocracy only works when the Lord your God, you love him with all your soul, all your heart, and all your mind, and that you declare yourself before him, and you are willing to be led by his will. Instead, they go for the other option. Let's let somebody else do that for us. Let's have a human king. Let's cry out for it. The judge who began to defeat the Philistines was Samson. That's what he was called to do. The one who finished and then judged was Samuel. That was what he was called to do. The vital bit of information which tells us why the Lord did it in this unusual way is not Samson's fall to Delilah. That's not what happened. It isn't that Samson was called to do this, but because he fell, God had to raise another judge up. Because Samuel is older than Samson is. Samuel was born before Samson. And just so we're aware, Samuel was also dedicated to the Lord before his birth. There are only 3 characters in the Bible who were Nazarites from birth. Do you know who they are? That's right. Samson, Samuel, and John the Baptist. And these two are working together. Not actually working together, but God is using them together. They were both called by birth. They were both born to barren women. And they were both dedicated and given to God over to serve him and to serve him forever. These 2 men were called at such a time as this. These are 2 witnesses. And for those of you that know your book of Revelation, Not that these are the two witnesses, but it's a type. It's another pattern element that they're called to drive out. Now, and if you want to push it even further, there are 7 lords of the Philistines. It is a 7-headed beast. So there's an even bigger type there that connects those things together and showing you that once again, the Bible is pattern. No, that's not the vital bit. The vital bit isn't that Samson fell, but the nation's failure in its relationship with the Lord. That's the reason. And thus, we understand it when we see this statement, when the ark is taken. Have a look at 1 Samuel chapter 4, and let's read verses 21 and 22. 1 Samuel 4, 21 and 22.
She named the child Ichabod, which means, where is the glory? For she said, Israel's glory is gone. She named him this because the ark of God had been captured, and because her father-in-law and husband were dead. Then she said, the glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured.
And just remember, just before Jephthah's call, the people had repented of already going away for 18 years. Now had the 6 years of Jephthah and their 25 years of their other judges, 31 years later, and then add another 10, 15 years on top of that. 46 years later, the phrase, the glory of God has departed. Now, you know what, Christians love throwing this on about, oh, the amount of times I've heard Christians say, it says Ichabod over your church. The glory of God has departed. And, yeah, that isn't the kind of the case. Because everybody says that that's the case because there's some sin in the camp. Everyone's looking for an Achan moment. As though that's it. Therefore, there's an Achan moment, the glory of God has departed. But that isn't what has happened. Of course, the children of Israel had sinned. They'd walked away from God. But the glory of God departed for 3 reasons. And these 3 reasons are also echoed by when Jesus, at the end of the Passion Week, walked out of the temple, shook the dust from his feet, and walked up the mountain of Olivet as the glory of God once again departed out of the temple, out of the eastern gate, and up the Olivet, exactly as Ezekiel had seen in his vision when the glory of God departed out of the temple and up the mountain of Olivet, out of the eastern gate. Here again, the glory of God departed. The Ark of the Covenant was taken. The Shekinah glory was gone. And it happens because of 3 things. First of all, when the Philistines came, they didn't cry out to the Lord to save them. Secondly, when the Lord sent a judge anyway to deliver them, this is what the children of Israel said. Turn to 1 Samuel 15 and let's read verses 11 to 13. (1 Samuel 15, 11 to 13).
I am sorry that I have made Saul king, for he has not been loyal to me and has refused to obey my command. Samuel was so deeply moved when he heard this that he cried out to the Lord all night. Early next morning, Samuel went to find Saul.
Sorry, that should be 5, not 15. My apologies. 1 Samuel 5, 11 to 13. No, it's not. It's 1 Judges. It's Judges. I don't even know why I put Samuel there. It's Judges 15, 11 to 13. I meant to do that as well. Judges 11. No, Judges 15. Just checking you're paying attention, that's all. Judges 15, 11 to 13. Thank you. Why we bring these souls.
So 3,000 men of Judah went down to get Samson at the cave at the rock of Etam. They said to Samson, do you not realize that the Philistines rule over us? What are you going to do to us? But Samson replied, I only did to them what they did to me. But the men of Judah told him, we have come to tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines. All right, Samson said, but promise that you won't kill me yourselves. We will only tie you up and hand you over to the Philistines. They replied, we won't kill you. So they tied him up with new ropes and brought him up from the rock.
Oh, how much like Christ is that one, eh? So they didn't actually cry out for a deliverer, just like they hadn't at the time of Jesus. Instead, they tried to deliver themselves. Then, when the deliverer was sent by God anyway, they rounded him up, they tied him up, and they handed him over to the Gentiles to get rid of him. Instead of being on the side of the man who'd been sent to save them, they handed him over to the enemy who'd been sent to destroy them. Issue number 2. And then the third issue, when in the end they did go to war against the Philistines, have a look at 1 Samuel 4, verses 3 to 7.
And when the people of Israel came to the camp, the elders of Israel said, why has the Lord defeated us today before the Philistines? Let us bring the ark of the covenant to the Lord here from Shiloh, that it may come among us and save us from the power of our enemies. But the people went to Shiloh and brought from there the ark of the covenant of the Lord of hosts, who was enthroned on the cherubim. And the 2 sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas, were there with the ark of the covenant of the Lord. As soon as the ark of the covenant of the Lord came into the camp, all Israel gave a mighty shout, so that the earth resounded. And when the Philistines heard the noise of the shouting, they said, what does this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews mean? And when they learned that the ark of the Lord had come into the camp, the Philistines were afraid, for they said, a God has come into the camp. And they said, woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us, who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness. Take courage and be men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves to the Hebrews as they have been to you. Be men and fight.
So here we have the third issue is they all seem to think God was in the box. God isn't in the box. And as the time of Jesus, after Jesus, they believed that God would have to come and save them if they started a war with Rome, and he didn't. In the same way that they believed that God would have to come and save them if they started a war with Nebuchadnezzar, and he didn't. Because they felt that they could put God in a position where he had no choice. In the same way that Judas thought, if I put Jesus in the position of death, he'll have to come out swinging. But you can't put God in the corner, just like you can't put baby in the corner. You can't put God in the corner, and you can't expect him to therefore come and do exactly what you think he's going to do, because that's not how the Lord works. They treated him like he was a prop. Like he was a prop, and like you can order God around when he must do something. And even David falls into this trap by sticking the ark on a cart and taking it to where he thinks it means. We often make this decision or idea that we can do something and God will have to support us in it because we said God would support us in it. And it rarely works out like that. And it rarely happens. Don't say, I'm doing this and God's going to have to do it. Just do what the Lord tells you to do. That's the obedient side of it. But here it is. It isn't Samson's Delilah issue that caused Samuel to take over. The whole issue we hear was that the glory of God had departed. And he had departed because the children of Israel had departed from him in every single way as possible. And that's exactly how Jesus walked out of the temple in the Passion Week. Samson was called to start a fight with the Philistines in order that Israel could not dwell in peace with its enemies. Not to get rid of its enemies. He was called to call that fight so that they had to deal with the issue. Remember this, the Lord won't let you have it. So stop trying to seek it, that peace. It can't happen and it won't happen. You won't get peace with the enemy. So don't make your deals, or don't go to your crossroads and hope that he'll make you a better guitar player. Don't do any of those kind of things along the line. You cannot make a deal with the enemy. There is no deal to be made with him whatsoever. He just wants to destroy. So, he was called to stick a stick in the junkyard dog so that he came out biting. Because we can't put God in the corner and make him act. But don't think that the Lord won't put us in the corner to see if we'll act. In fact, he does it quite a lot. Samson was called not to wipe out the Philistines, but to cause the people of the Lord to eventually seek after him with all their hearts. To which the one who was called for restoration, Samuel, rededicated them to the Lord, and they saw the Lord give them the victory. Both were dedicated to the Lord before their births, having been born to barren women, and it's important that we know this background. Without it, it's impossible to see the importance of the man. Think about all this history that's carrying on around us. Samson was called to make it uncomfortable for the Israelites, so that under Samuel, they would come to a rededication of who they were. And that they might now call upon the Lord. So that gives us that history. But what do we learn from the chapter then? So what does this chapter throw into that? And it's to that above narrative, really, that Judges 13 gives us the biggest clues as to the state of the population. See, if the issue is that the glory of God departed because of the way that people were acting, how does that show us that here before Samson was even born? Bearing in mind that that tells us that Samson was a considerably young man, a man who was in his late teens when he started on his ministry, and then carried on for another 20 years to minister and to judge. Now it is to the above narrative that Judge 13 gives us that clue. Because there's one thing that stands out, a couple of verses really that jump out, but one great big point which I don't think can be overlooked. This chapter doesn't really tell us anything about Samson. It's all about Samson's parents. This is a chapter that's all about them. And quite frankly, other than the fact that we know that Samson's going to be a Nazirite from birth, we don't really get anything about him in this chapter. So why do we need a chapter that's about Samson's parents? What is Samuel, the writer of the book of Judges, trying to show us? Well, there's some scriptures here which point out to me why the Lord is revealing information about Samson's parents. First one, let's have a look at Judges 13 and let's read verses 8 to 14. What do we see here? Judges 13, 8 to 14.
Manoah prayed to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I beg you to let the man of God you sent to us come again to teach us how to bring up the boy who is to be born." God heard him, and the angel of God came to the woman while she was out in the field. But her husband Manoah was not with her. The woman hurried to tell her husband, "He's here, the man who appeared to me the other day." Manoah got up and followed his wife. When he came to the man, he said, "Are you the man who talked to my wife?" I am, he said. So Manoah asked him, "When your words are fulfilled, what is to be the rule that governs the boy's life and work?" The angel of the Lord answered, "Your wife must do all that I have told her. She must not eat anything that comes from the grapevine, nor drink any wine or other fermented drink, nor eat anything unclean. She must do everything I have commanded her."
Now, does something jump out to you in those verses? Go on. The I am is there. You've got that? It is the angel of the Lord. But what direct question does Manoah ask twice, both in prayer and directly to the angel of the Lord? That's exactly right. He tells him, he asks the question, what should we do about his upbringing? You'd say he's to be a Nazirite. It's almost as though they don't know what a Nazirite is. But you're saying he's to be a Nazirite. What do we do about his upbringing? Because it is the responsibility of the parents to train a child in the way that it should go. So they are asking, shall we say, a good parental question of the Lord. You're calling the man, so how do we train him? And you're absolutely right, Janet. The Lord gives them no reply whatsoever to that. In fact, the reply, you might as well say, is nothing. Your job is to make sure a healthy baby is born. Then stay out of my way. Well, I mean, do you think it's because they should have known anyway? Okay, so that's the question. So here are the parents. They are Jewish. They're Jewish, so they have the law. They've got Levites who should be coming and teaching them the law anyway. You've got judges who are around about, who are here because there's a time period of this. So should they not be being taught these things? But seemingly what the Lord is saying here to them is, all you've got to do is make sure you don't drink any wine while he's in the womb, and that you don't drink any grapes. No grapes, no wine. If they'd have said no soft cheese and no fish as well, then it would have been like every midwife going. But but in the sense here, I mean, this is good maternity advice now for any women out there. Don't drink whilst there's a child in the womb whatsoever that comes along, or smoke. Those are two things, but the angel of the Lord didn't say that either. In fact, but it is abundantly clear. He's making it sure that their only responsibility is to make sure that Samson is a Nazirite in the womb, as well as out of the womb. Once he's out of the womb, he's my job. But when he's in the womb, although it is still the Lord that knits them together, what you put in your body is going into his. So I don't want you to do this. The Lord has given them a simple, sharpened instruction. And to make sure that we are aware that that's the case, Manoah prays the answer. And the Lord sends him the angel of the Lord, and he asks the angel of the Lord the same question, and the angel of the Lord deliberately gives him no answer whatsoever, which we have to understand is, it's got nothing to do with you. In a sense, what the Lord is saying is, I'm going to be his parents. You're not fit. Now that has got, I mean, maybe you saw that, maybe you didn't see that, but that jumps out. Now, you holding on to that going, gosh, that's shocking. Except for it's not as shocking when you connect it with the history that I've just told you about the glory of God departing and the fact that they rejected Samson anyway and actually tried to hand him over to the Gentiles to kill him. It gives you the understanding of where people are in the fact that his own parents are in this. And he's actually shown a little bit further. Look at the last two verses, verses 24 and 25. Who is it that's going to instruct him? Can somebody read them out for me?
So the woman bore a son and called his name Samson, and the child grew, and the Lord blessed him. And the Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him at Manahadan between Zorah and Eshtaol.
It was the Lord who moved Samson in his life. It was the Lord who was this. The parental responsibility of instruction was to be brought upon by the Lord. Who had the parental responsibility of instruction for Samuel? Was also the Lord. He was brought before the Lord to do the same. Does that mean that Hannah was a bad parent or Elkanah was a bad parent? Well, we can't say that they were. We can't say that they weren't. All that we can say is the Lord had decided the instruction needed to come from him. And we go back to this understanding. If the barrel where the apples are is rotten, then everything that goes in the barrel is going to get rotten. The only way that you can get a fresh apple is go to the tree and take it off. And figuratively, the Lord has gone to find himself two judges out of the womb because he needs to get them fresh. He means to get them before they have been tainted by the traditions of the elders and the sins of the parents and of the nature of. You see, they've taken a religion and they've added and they've subtracted. We were watching Songs of Praise last Sunday. You can tell when we get back early from the Sunday morning if it's still on. And then sometimes it comes on and I go, oh, it makes you cringe, doesn't it? You're like going, that's the best the BBC can do for Christian. We're going to have a contemporary song on now. We're going to sing Shine Jesus Shine. Yes, that was contemporary in the 80s. But the reason that kind of, we were watching and we were talking about the Coptic Christians in Egypt. And as they're showing a Coptic ceremony, here is the guy in the frock walking around the temple and he's swinging a vase full of incense. And he's swinging it round and then he's going backwards and another guy's checking that he doesn't fall. And you're watching him do it and everybody's watching him do it. And I said to Micah, how did that happen? Where did this come from? I mean, it's not even, I mean, you could say sometimes we grab bits of Judaism and put them into the church, but this isn't even Judaism. None of it's in the Old Testament. None of it's in the New Testament. At what point in history did the church go, you know what we're missing in our service? A frock-wearing guy swinging incense around his head. Yeah, you're right. That's what we need. It's just, and you go, where did it come from? At what point did that seem like, yeah, that's what we should do in worship? I mean, it's mental. I mean, to use that vernacular, but it is just, it is. And you think, I don't get it. I don't get how we got that. I mean, I could tell you the chicken story again and say, why does the legs come off the chicken or the turkey? And it's because great-grandma's oven was too small. And I get how something gets passed down the generations and we don't know why. But where was the too small oven that caused this frock-wearing, incense-swinging priest with walking backwards around while somebody else is carrying a crown? Yes, that screams Jesus to me. It's like, what? Now, the reason I say that, rather than to just to get that out of the kind of thing, is because it shows you that sometimes all kinds of things can get involved in the relationship, and it comes to the point where you go, hang on, we've got to declutter all of this. We've got to get it out. We've got to get back to the basics of our Christianity. And of course, you have the periods where people throw everything out. But as I shared last night, unfortunately, what tends to happen is they don't just throw out the bad stuff. They throw a lot of the good stuff out with it as well. Then they go, instead of swinging back to normality, they swing to the extreme on the other side, which is the case. So, you get the Lutherans who swing from a works-based salvation to a grace-based salvation, that they go so far over here that even to accept grace is a work, and therefore there is no real understanding as to whether you've received grace or not. It's just a gift of God, and you'll find out at the end if your cracker's got one in or not. The Lord had to call these two judges in a way that they were not going to be tainted by the situation and the place that people had come. In all that Eli and Phinehas and Hophni and all of the things that had been transmuted through the society. But when we get to these two parents, well, they still have responsibility as providers. They're still the ones that go and get him the wife. They're still the ones that are feeding him. They're still the ones that are clothing him in the same way that Hannah's still the one that's clothing Samuel. So why did the Lord take this instructional task away from the parents and take it on directly to himself? Well, the answer's got to be very much seen in the background story I've given to you of the state of the people, which is very much then shown in the attitude of Manoah and his wife. Now, it's typified by the reaction Manoah gives to the information the angel of the Lord gives to him. Have a look at verse 17. What does that say? Chapter 13, verse 17.
And Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, "What is your name? And when your words come to pass, we may honour you."
Isn't that an odd phrasing? It is an odd phrasing. In fact, it's so much of an odd phrasing that the angel of the Lord picks up on it in the next verse. Because he says to him, The angel of the Lord said to him, why do you ask my name, seeing it is wonderful? But some versions of the Bible, I notice mine doesn't say, go, why do you ask in such a way? Why do you ask in such a way? What an odd phrasing, an odd way of asking. Why do you ask in such a way? Well, what is he asking? What is the name? What is your name, that when your words come to pass, we may honour you? Well, he is, but hear the phrase again. What is your name, that we may honour you when it comes to pass? When do we worship God? All the time. But we worship God before. That is the act of faith that we give out. You know, Mark often shares some great verses on workplace that are very encouraging when they come to worship, as a worship leader should do. He encourages us in that phrase, and a lot of them are on this idea of understanding that praise in itself has the power to break chains. It has the power to make that. The first year that we had here with this is our year of reaping the harvest of our expectations. Our first year was a year of celebration, and we had absolutely nothing to celebrate, except that we were giving thanks for what we believed God was going to do. And if we knew then what we knew now that God had done in these next 6 years, including most of the people in this room, who are these great gifts that we've received from the Lord, then we may have given thanks to God even more at that time. But the reason that we did it before is because God wasn't going to do something if we didn't exercise within ourselves a faith. Faith is not fatalism. Faith reacts before. Faith reacts after. And Manoah was not a man of faith in this statement, but in a sense, I want your name in case this doesn't happen. Where there's blame, there is a claim. Where do you live? And what's your name? But the Lord's answer back to him is equally strange, in a sense. Because the Lord says to him, my name is too wonderful for you. But what does he say to Moses when Moses asks that question? I am. What does he say to Joshua when Joshua asks that question? I am the Lord, I am the captain of the hosts. And that's the same guy that Joshua talked to that he's talking to. The Lord answers that question. How does he answer it when Moses, he tells him, the Lord, or Jehovah, Jehovah, and gives the explanation of his meaning, but to Manoah, you don't need to know. You don't actually want to know Manoah. It's too wonderful for you. You don't want to know. And then to give you a sense of who Manoah is, and I might be asking the question, couldn't you have picked better parents than God? You know, it's kind of like, you are God. You didn't have to pick these two. You could have picked somebody else. Hannah seemed a godly person. Why didn't we get another Hannah out here? But he didn't. He picked Manoah and his wife. She doesn't even get a name. And, in fairness, the angel of the Lord only really wanted to talk to the woman. She's the one that went and kept getting her husband. Now, the Lord was faithful to come back and to talk to him. And there's an understanding here. And we could look at a number of times that the angel of the Lord came down and spoke. When Joshua saw him in Joshua 5:13 to 15, immediately worship is offered and the Lord explains that he's on the Lord's side. Once he says the answer to the question, are you for us or are you against us? And the answer is no, but I am the angel of the Lord. Joshua doesn't need to hear, yeah, but whose side are you on? He gets it. I'm not going to ask you to align yourself with me, God. I need to align myself with you. And he worships God and he works in a sense. Then we see the angel of the Lord again at the end of Joshua's period. In Judges chapter 2, where the angel of the Lord came down and said, you had me and you didn't use me. And so I'm not going to drive these people out. And that place is called Boakim, which means the place of weeping, a genuine repentance. That's in Judges 2, verses 1 to 5. There's no crocodile tears here. There's an act of true repentance, as shown by their act of sacrifice. So when they see the angel of the Lord, it has that reaction to them. In Judges 6, verses 12 to 24, when Gideon sees the angel of the Lord, at first he just thinks it's one of his neighbours after steal bread, pretending he's Jesus. But when he starts to realize exactly who it is, and he even tests God and says, I'm going to give you a sacrifice, let's see what you do with it, and the Lord burns up the sacrifice. In fact, let's just have a look at Judges 6, and let's read verses 22 to 24. I'm taking a guess at that as well.
Now Gideon perceived that he was the angel of the Lord. So Gideon said, Alas, O Lord God, for I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. Then the Lord said to him, Peace be with you, do not fear, you shall not die. So Gideon built an altar there to the Lord, and called it the Lord is Peace. To this day it is still in offer of the Abazar.
We'll leave it there.
Yeah.
Because it was a guess and it was the wrong one. The verse 20 is what I was after. The angel of God said to him, Take the meat and the unleavened bread, lay them on this rock and pour out the broth. And he did so. Then the angel of the Lord put out the end of the staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and unleavened bread. The fire rose out of the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread, and the angel of the Lord departed out of his sight. Here we see the Lord consuming the offering, the sacrifice given. And even though Gideon had a lack of faith moment with this, he still was called of God, and God was still willing to deal with his unbelief and help him to come to a moment of belief. But not so with Manoah. With Manoah, the Lord won't even touch it. We read it here in verses 15 to 16 of Judges 13. Then Manoah said to the angel of the Lord, Please let us detain you, and we will prepare a young goat for you. The angel of the Lord said to Manoah, Though you detain me, I will not eat your food. But if you offer a burnt offering, you must offer it to the Lord, for Manoah did not know he was the angel of the Lord. I won't eat your food. Now, it says food in my Bible. Does it say anything other than food in anybody else's Bible? I will not eat anything. That's good. The Hebrew word for food is also the direct translation for the word bread. And it's important because in Hebrew dietary law, bread goes with everything. That's also true in my house. But bread goes with absolutely everything. If you can't have bread with it, don't have it. So, other than jelly, if it's green. Then the only green food allowed in my house. But the fact is that bread is the case. I'm not going to eat your bread. So is that natural? Is that what the angel of the Lord does? Well, he is the angel of God. He wouldn't eat. He's a spiritual being. Well, except for the fact that everybody else that the angel of the Lord meets with, he's quite happy to have a meal with. In fact, you're absolutely right, and that's an important scripture. So let's turn to Genesis 18, verses 1 to 8, because Manoah offers this food, the Lord won't touch it, but that's not normal. The Lord consumed Gideon's. Jesus ate the disciples' fish and bread when he was raised from the dead. And in the tradition of Israel, the original father of faith was such an offering before the Lord, a right one. Well, what did we read here? Let's have a look. Genesis 18, 1 to 8.
Then the Lord appeared to him by the terebinth tree of Mamre, as he was sitting in the tent door in the heat of the day. So he lifted his eyes and looked, and behold, 3 men were standing by him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them, and bowed himself to the ground, and said, My Lord, if I have now found favour in your sight, do not pass on your servant. Please let a little water be brought, and wash your feet, and rest yourselves under the tree. And I will bring a morsel of bread, that you may refresh your hearts. After that you may pass by, inasmuch as you have come to your servants. They said, Do as you have said. So Abraham hurried into the tent to Sarah and said, "Quickly, make ready 3 measures of fine meal, knead it and make cakes." And Abraham ran to the herd and took tender and good calf, gave it to a young man, and he hastened to prepare it. So he took butter and milk and the calf which he had prepared and set it before them, and he stood by them under the tree as they ate.
Amen. So the angel of the Lord came and had dinner. Came and had dinner with him, and 3 measures of meal. Now that 3 measures of meal appears again in Scripture. It appears in Matthew 13, the kingdom parables, where a woman hides a little leaven in the 3 measures of meal. But the 3 measures of meal in the ancient East, they didn't make bread for it to go off. They carried around the ready mix, and when friends came, they made it there and then, because people weren't in the rush that they had to have it there and then. They would wait the time it would take for the cakes to be made, the bread to be made, and then they would eat it. This was a dining experience that took all afternoon for them to experience and have a time together where he washed their feet and he put a little ointment on, and they conversed and they talked as men about, they were going to talk about the promise that God was making to him. But the angel of the Lord consumed him. So why wouldn't the angel of the Lord consume this offering or eat the bread? And why did he only dwell in the flame? Well, the second part first. Dwelling within the flame, but not consuming the offering. You've already said it. Who does that remind us of? The burning bush. That's the I am. And in a sense, you might say that that's exactly what happens here. The minute that they see the angel of the Lord in the flame, but not consuming the offering, is the minute that they realize they're not talking to some fella who's just walked over from the field with an idea. This is God. This is the angel of the Lord. This is the great I am. And of course, we read there in that kind of fear that comes upon them. This element that the Lord, well, why has he done it? Well, he's identifying himself to them. Manoah, I have given your wife this instruction. This is who I am. To you, that means something. And of course, he tells us, as that happens, they fall upon their face. And in verse 22, we read this phrase, and Manoah said to his wife, we shall surely die because we've seen God. And there's a sideline. Have you noticed that everybody says that, and it never happens? And I'm not kind of saying because God doesn't do it. And it makes you wonder, doesn't it? And this is a complete sideline. But every time you read that, from Isaiah to everybody, they seem to be so certain that God wants to strike them dead. He told Moses, you can't see my face, or you will surely die. And that gives us the understanding here, except for even Moses got to see the angel of the Lord, because on the day of the transfiguration, there was Moses, and he got to see Jesus. Here he is, the angel of the Lord. Who is the angel of the Lord? Well, the angel of the Lord is Jesus. It's a Christophany. As Jesus in his resurrected body, and now this is where we all go cross-eyed, because Jesus is born, he lives, he dies, he's resurrected, he's ascended, and then he appears in the Old Testament. You can do that. He appears in the Old Testament in that it is the angel of the Lord. It's the very same one that Moses saw, that Abraham saw. So in that presence and understanding, they have this expectation. But as for the offering, well, the Lord didn't consume it, but then Manoah's wife goes on to say, his wife said, if the Lord had desired to kill us, he would not have accepted a burnt offering and a grain offering from our hands. Nor would he have shown us all these things, nor would he have told us such things as these at this time. The Lord clearly accepted the offering, but he didn't consume it. And as he said in verse 16, I won't eat it. Manoah's wife rightly discerned the Lord did receive it. So why not consume it? Why not consume it when he's consumed everybody else? Especially when the Lord's consumed everyone else's. Well, going back to our Matthew 13 moment, we understand that if we go back to Abraham, who's the first to offer the Lord food, he does it in the 3 measures of meal, and it's what we call a fellowship offering. So it's food between fellowship. Now, what is fellowship? And it's an important question because it's a word that isn't really used outside of the church unless you've got the Lord of the Rings on. In fact, until the Lord of the Rings used it in the film, nobody had heard it for years. But we as Christians knew it. Yet fellowship is something that now seems to be all over the place. I mean, I know at St. Wilfrid's, they've got it as part of their 9 pebbles that everybody has to have. And they use the word, the actual right word, the Greek word, koinonia. And koinonia is a simple word, actually. It's a very common, and it's not friendship. But it's two people coming together for the purpose of developing one another in their relationships with the Lord. So we can meet together and be friends, but we can meet together and be friends and encourage one another to be better Christians. And we could do that by praying together. That's koinonia. We could do that by worshipping together. That's koinonia. We could do that by coming and sharing the word with one another. That's koinonia. We could do it by breaking and having a fellowship meal together and encouraging and praying and serving and giving. It's all koinonia. It's not a friend. It's more than that. It has a development process and purpose within it. Now, if you remember, because I've been speaking about this a lot and I shared it very much last week, what are the only 2 reasons that it's not acceptable to fellowship with somebody? So if they preach a completely different gospel, and what's the other one? If they will not love the Lord with all their heart, all their soul, and all their mind. Now, the first one's dead easy. Or somebody preaches a completely different gospel. Yeah, I get that. The second one? What? I mean, surely the Lord, there are more important reasons why we shouldn't fellowship with someone other than they don't love you. But actually, friends, there isn't. Because all the law and all the prophets hangs on the statement, love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your mind, and love your neighbour as yourself. And if you're not willing to get into that game, people who come to me on a regular basis and say, I don't have to do anything once I've accepted Jesus as Saviour, and you're outrageous to suggest that I should. I would sit here and come back to you and say, but if you're choosing to do absolutely nothing, what are you saying to the Lord? What are you saying to him about that relationship with him? Now, I'm not saying that means you don't love him, but I'm saying that you are on a road which will mean you don't care about him, because what's important to him is really not important to you. What's important to you is you. And all that's important to you about God is when God can do things for you. And you're already on a road that is going to take you out the door when you find out that God is not at your beck and call. As he says, what master of you has a servant, when he's worked in the field, comes back and says, sit down, let me take care of you? No. Instead, you bring him in and you say, serve me my meal before you have yours. And I say to you, that is the nature of our understanding and relationship with the Lord. He is our master. He is our Lord. It's our declaration in salvation that comes along. So, if those 2 things are the reason that the Lord would not eat bread, or should I say that we shouldn't have fellowship, and therefore to eat their food is to say, I'm in fellowship with you, I agree with you, so I'm not breaking bread with you. Then what is it about Manoah that the Lord doesn't agree with? What is it about the Lord that Manoah doesn't agree with? Is he preaching a different gospel? Well, we are pre-grace here, so probably not. So does he not love the Lord with all his heart, all his soul, and all his mind? And this explains something to us. Because if Samson is the last judge, and Samson's story ends at the end of Judges 16, why is there a Judges 17 through to 21? Well, it does. In fact, what's in Judges 17 to 21 are 3 case studies of how bad things have got. And in this respect, one of them helps us here. What tribe is Manoah from? He's from the tribe of Dan. So what's wrong with Dan? Dan should have been up in the north. Have a look at Judges 1, verse 34.
The Amorites pressed the people of Dan back into the hill country, for they did not allow them to come down to the plain.
So Dan never actually took his own land. Some of the children of Israel didn't take all of their land. Dan didn't take any of their land. And tells us that, in fact, that what they did is they ran away. So where did they run away to? Well, turn with me now to Judges 18, and let's read verse 1.
In those days there was no king in Israel, and in those days the tribe of the Danites was seeking an inheritance for itself to dwell in, for until that day their inheritance among the tribes of Israel had not fallen to them.
They actually started looking for different land. They never took the land that God had gave them. They rejected their inheritance before they even had their inheritance. And we often don't really realize this about the tribe of Dan, but they are the black sheep of the family. Because the tribe of Dan, it tells us, instead of, well, what should they have done? They should have sought after the Lord, because that's exactly what the Lord said, and exactly what the Lord admonished them for in chapter 2. They should have sought the Lord and said, Lord, fight for us. We need this land. We need to take it. You have given it to us. It is our inheritance. We have come from Egypt. We have wandered the wilderness for 40 years. We have fought alongside our brothers and sisters. We now need our land. Fight for us. And the Lord said he would have. But they didn't. Instead, they went to look for their own land. And so they rejected the inheritance of God. And when they found their own land, what did they do with it? Well, let's have a look at verses 27 to 31 of chapter 18. Judges 18, 27 to 31.
So they took the things Micah had made and the priest who had belonged to him, and went to Laish, to the people quiet and secure, and they struck them with the edge of the sword and burned the city with fire. There was no deliverer, because it was far from Sidon, and they had no ties with anyone. It was in the valley that belongs to Beth Rehob. So they built the city and dwelt there. And they called the name of the city Dan, after the name of Dan, their father, who was born to Israel. However, the name of the city formerly was Laish. The children of Dan set up for themselves the carved image, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, and his sons were priests to the tribe of Dan until the day of the captivity of the land. So they set up for themselves Micah's carved image, which he made all the time that the house of God was in Shiloh.
So the tribe of Dan not only rejected the inheritance of God, they went out and got their own land, and then they turned it into their own religion. They didn't worship God, they didn't have the Levites, and they didn't go to the temple. Instead, Micah, the naughty boy, made his own idol, which they stole, and they took a load of other ones as well, and they started with their own priesthood, their own religion, and their own kind of whole situation right here in the middle of the promised land. So how bad is it? We'll have a look at Revelation chapter 7. And we're not going to read it, but just have a read down from verse 5 to verse 8. Which tribe is missing out of the 144,000? Now that's pretty serious, isn't it? When we talk about the elect of God, the ones who have a guaranteed, irresistible grace. When we talk about the ones who will be saved in that tribulation period, which tribe is missing? Dan. It's pretty serious. However, here's the good news, and surprising ones. They're still there at the end. They still make it through, but they come through the same way that we come through as Gentiles. The gift of God that is given to Israel for going through what it goes through, which is that they are the elect of God does not get given to Dan. They are singled out. Why? Because at the beginning they rejected God and God's promise. Now, put it this way. They've got their own Levites, and they're not Levites. They've got their own idols, and it's not God. It's not even a golden calf. They've got their own religion. They've got their own place. And they obviously have still some kind of understanding of the word, but not much. Would you let those parents bring up Samson? Would you let those parents be the ones to teach the man of God, to teach the judge how to judge? No. The Lord had to be his instructor. Moriel, the Lord is my teacher. He had to be, because of the situation, in the same way that Eli, Hophni and Phinehas could not be Samuel's teachers because of their behavior. Manoah and his wife could not be Samson's because of their situation. Now that does still kind of throw a bit of a question up, because you might say, there are 12 other tribes, Lord, none of who have rejected their inheritance and decided to go their own way. Why not pick one of them? And I think that there are two answers to that question. The first one, which is an incidental one, but I think quite an important one, and I hope that you can grasp hold of this. If you're watching this on the live stream, I hope you can grasp hold of this. If you're watching this on playback on YouTube, I hope that you can grasp hold of this. This proves to you that God can call anybody out of anywhere. It really doesn't matter your situation or the situation of your parents. What they've done, where they are, how they've behaved, the Lord can call anybody from anywhere, and he can change that situation around, even if they are being brought up in a godless horror. God is still God, and he overwrites all things. Now, I think that that throws out some amazing thoughts to our children's work, to our youth work, to our ladies' work, to our men's work, to our seniors' work, to anybody who is feeling downcast, who's feeling rejected, who's feeling any of those things. As the kind of phrase goes out, you are not your past, and you are not your father's past, and you are not your mother's past. You are the Lord's future. And, you know, if we're going to be name it and claim it, claim that, friends. Claim it, because it's true. It's true of this guy. It's true of this man of God. And it's true. And it's a wonderful thought. Secondly, one, I kind of kept alluding to it, so it's got less impact to say it now. But it is the fact that had Samson come from one of the other tribes, he may not have been in a godless situation. What he would have been is in, shall we say, a denominational situation, where the traditions and the religion would have a considerable pull and impact on his life. We always fill blanks with what we know. We assume as children that everybody else is having the same tea as us, that teachers live at school, and that all it is, because that's why children freak out whenever they see a teacher in a supermarket. They can't get their head around it whatsoever. That kind of comes, what are those teachers doing out of there? Did the headmaster know that they've left? That kind of comes. But they do. And there comes a point in your kind of life as you go, you get friends and you go around your friends' house for tea, that you realise they don't eat the same food as you. They don't act the same way. Their mum and dad don't talk the same way that your mum and dad talk. It may be better. It may be worse. You may go home and give your mum a hug and go, thank you, mother, for being my mother. Or you may go back and look at them and go, why don't they give me bread and butter pudding every night for tea? That kind of comes along. There is a development that kind of grows, and as we grow, we get this, we always fill blanks with what we know, and the assumption that everyone is like us. And we know that everyone isn't like us, but we still keep thinking everyone's like us in a concept, because how can we think differently when we've only been taught to think one way? If somebody is brought up in a situation where nobody thinks about the Lord but in the wrong way, then everything about the Lord is brand new anyway. He hasn't got to have reprogramming or things undone or things unsaid or things changed or things done differently. As a church, we run differently than many of us are used to. But for our young people, this is the only kind of church that they've known. So the way that we run our church to them is how they expect churches to be run. And if you talk to, Dan tells me this all the time. So if Dan goes and works at another church or does something with another church, it freaks him out a little bit that they aren't like we are. So, Dan will share his opinion with me, particularly if he doesn't agree with something I'm doing. He'll go and do that somewhere else, and they do not like it. At all. And it surprises him.
Genuinely does as well.
In the same way that it does with a lot of things. And there's a lot of kind of ways that come out. Now, for the rest of us, and particularly for me, we have to unlearn things. Because we got brought up in traditions that kind of, that we thought that were right. And I find, particularly with Bible study, I have a lot of my traditions undone. So my view on Samson, before I read this today, was fallen character. Fallen character that God uses. The one good redeemable thing about him is he speaks in parables like Jesus does. And today I can come to the end of this conclusion and go, he's actually a hero. A genuine character who does the hard things and is rejected by his own people, who makes a bad decision at the end of his life. And actually that wakes him up to me, but even more so, the idea of his horrendous background and God calling him from birth to be more than the constituent parts and the life that is around him. Don't assume because children are brought up in drugs and crime that it means that they have to go through drugs and crime. And there was a young man that came to our youth group. He came all the time here, and I used to say it to him all the time. He had older brothers, and he knew they were involved in drugs, they were involved in this, and they were involved in that. And the first time he did drugs, and he was brought to me, and we had a conversation, I said to him, listen, you already know where this road leads to. So why on earth do you think if you go down it, it will be any different for you than it was for anybody else? There's nothing inevitable about it. Not when God's involved. When God's involved, he can call people from their mother's womb to be different, to be a light in the darkness. And that's what Samson cries out to us. Before he's even been born, the Lord shows us the very darkness that this light was born into. In the end, the first chapter gives the reader a clear understanding of the issues. Exactly what Samson climbed out from. How he came back to the Lord and how the Lord raised a judge to draw the people to himself. And then, how he raised a second judge who came to destroy the enemy. 2 judges. 2 comings. One to bring the people through jealousy back to him. And the other to bring a judgment on the enemy. It's amazing what God can give us from his word. It's amazing what studying his word can reveal to us about the Lord. And I hope tonight that as you leave, if just with one thought, it's the thought that if God can use Samson so supernaturally, why can't he use me? And let us echo the words of Isaiah.